I'm going to take my 300 grams of all-purpose flour and empty them onto my work surface. And the next thing that you want to do is make a well in your flour, like this. So we're basically making a bowl for our eggs out of flour. And then we are going to crack our 3 eggs into that well. So go 1. Get your fork and have your bench scraper by your side. We'll come to the bench scraper. But for now, we're going to use our fork and we're just going to beat up our eggs. I'm not looking for a smooth paste out of these eggs. I'm just looking to break them up and roughly beat them. And then with the tines of my fork, I'm going to start working the flour from the inside edges of my well into my egg. Again, I'm not looking for a smooth paste. A lumpy flour and egg mixture is totally fine. I'm just trying to stabilize my eggs at this point so that if I break the edges of my well of flour, that egg won't run away from me. And that happens pretty fast. Okay, so at this point, I still have a pretty wet mixture, but it's quite stable. If you look at it, it's not moving. It's lumpy. That's cool. We're going to make this smooth by kneading. We're not trying to mix it with our fork to make it smooth. That's going to happen in the kneading process. So now grab your bench scraper, and I want you to push away from you clean flour. You don't want any egg in this flour, so we're just going to push away, I don't know, about 3/4 of a cup of that flour. So that is, and I always like to do it away from me. I see customers want to do it off to the side, or they'll do lots of little piles. Just do one pile at the back behind your well, okay? So this flour now is separated, and we can add it as we need to, all right? And then I'm going to flick some of the flour from the edges into my egg, and I'm keeping mixing with my fork. I'm mixing it into my egg here. And I'm going to keep flicking more flour in. Right now I have a really wet, eggy mixture, and I know it needs more flour. The ultimate texture of your pasta dough is going to be moist, but not wet. Moist, but not wet and sticky. So as long as you see that your egg is wet like this, it needs more flour. At some point, I'm going to slow down on the addition of flour, because I'd rather have a soft dough than a really hard dough. And it's much easier to fix a dough that's too wet than to fix a dough that's too dry. So don't get over excited about adding flour. Just take your time. But right now I've still got a really wet egg mixture. So I'm flicking in at this point a few tablespoons full of flour at a time. I'll slow that flour addition down fairly soon, but it's still really wet, so I'm going with a bit more. So the progression is from mixing with a fork to mixing with a bench scraper, and then ultimately we'll get our hands in there and start kneading our dough. So I'm now taking my bench scraper and I'm going to scrape off what's on my fork. I've got a mixture that's still moist. If I feel it, it's still really moist, but it's not wet. Okay, so I'm going to set that fork aside, and I'm going to switch to using my bench scraper. So at this point, I've still got the pile of flour away from me over here. I'm not touching that yet, but everything that was around my egg is now into those eggs. I got about at least a cup of flour set aside. I will need some of that flour, but I have control now over how much I add, and I'm using my bench scraper to cut now the flour into my dough. And I'm getting underneath it and scraping up what's on my counter back into that dough also. So now, if you take your finger and you feel a bit of that dough, if it's coming away sticky, you know you need some more flour. Mine is, so I'm going to go, at this point, 1 to 2 tablespoons of flour at a time. Don't overdo it. Everybody's flour and eggs is going to be different. So we'll all have a slightly different amount of flour left at the end. And we won't waste that flour. That flour will be what we use for dusting when we're rolling out our pasta, which is why we've got the sieve sitting in the bowl. Because we'll pass that excess flour through the sieve to catch any bits of egg, any lumpy bits, and then we've got dusting flour. So if I feel this now, okay, it's still a little sticky. I'm going a bit more flour. And at this point, I'm going to work this, I'm going to flour my hands a little bit. Here we go. And I'm going to scrape up what's under my bits of dough and work this into a ball of dough, okay? So, as I do this, it's tacky and sticky on my hands. And because of that, I know I need some flour. So I'm just adding a pinch, okay? And I'm starting to knead it. And as I knead it, I can feel that it's sticking to the heel of my hand, all right? You don't want to feel it stick. You want it to be moist, but you don't want it sticking to you. So I'm going to add another pinch of flour and just continue. And my kneading motion is that the heel of my hand is going into the center of my dough here, and I'm doing a short push away. It's like an inch, stretching my dough, folding it towards me into the center, and then turning it a quarter turn. And then again, into the center here with the heel of my hand, a short push away, and into the center and a turn. And that's kneading, okay? At this point, you should have a fairly robust dough. It's not super soft, but it's also not dry and hard. And we're going to start working this by kneading it. Okay, so we keep going. We've got all kinds of lumps on the counter. Our dough is lumpy. That's okay. That's how pasta dough is at this stage of the game. So I'm continuing that kneading motion. And every time I do that kneading motion, I'm not flipping my dough. I'm turning it like a clock around so that the seam is always on the top. That's actually quite important to keep that seam on the top. You're always folding in to the seam on the top. As I knead my dough, I know I have a pretty nice texture on my dough here. So I've got some lumpy bits on my counter. I'm actually going to scrape those up so that I have a clean counter underneath the dough that I'm kneading. And I'm going to pick them up, okay, like so, and just pass them through the sieve, all right? This is garbage. This is nice flour for dusting. And my hands are a little lumpy, so what you can do is take a little bit of your flour. If you grab a garbage, I've got one here, you can just rub that flour into your hands, and it actually helps get it off your hands before you go and wash it in the sink. Because when you wash your hands in the sink with dough like this, it really makes a mess in your sink. So if you can get more of it off first, but I do want to clean and dry my hands because I got lumps of egg on them right now, and all those lumps will end up in my pasta dough. So I'm just running off to wash my hands before I continue, and then we're going to continue kneading. You don't want to leave your dough sitting for too long, certainly here in Alberta, because our air is really dry. I'm from the UK, and I first learned to make pasta in the UK, and it's very different there. We've got very humid air. We're at sea level. It behaves very differently. Here in Alberta, things dry out really fast. So don't leave it for too long to wash your hands. At this point, I have a nice pasta dough. It's nice and firm. I know from feeling it, I'm not going to need the rest of that flour. That's extra. Every time I make this, it's different. I've got quite a stiff dough, which is really nice for cut pasta. When you're doing filled pasta like raviolis, you want to err on the side of a slightly softer pasta dough because it needs to stick to itself. But for cut pasta, it's nice to have a slightly firmer dough. And now while we're kneading, any questions about kneading, throw them at me. I'm just continuing this action of the heel of my hand into the center, folding it in, and I'm just continuing that short motion. I'm trying not to tear my gluten. One other thing about kneading, what I was taught by the woman who taught me to make pasta is, this is a stiff dough, it's a lot of work. If you're trying to take the muscle work out of it, roll on the balls of your feet so that you're putting your body weight into each kneading motion. So we're just gonna continue kneading, and what we're looking for is a springy, smooth dough. In Italy, I think they describe it as, you want the texture to be smooth like a baby's bum. So very, very smooth, or like a baby's cheek. So it shouldn't be lumpy. And you're gonna find if your work surface is really floury, you're not gonna get it as smooth. So once you're happy with the texture of your dough, do what I did and just clear away excess flour. It's very, I think pasta making is kind of therapeutic. It's one of those, you just gotta put a little muscle into it. It's like going to the gym. Okay. So if I turn my dough now over, I'm getting a nice smooth dough happening here. It's springy, it's smooth. I'm happy with my dough. I'm actually gonna work it into a ball. I'm doing what I call chafing it, where I'm just trying to work the seam together at the bottom. Just got a few little bits of flour in it with the sides of my hands. So I'm bringing together that seam on the bottom a little bit. And I'm gonna go and grab a piece of plastic wrap. So there's my plastic wrap, and just tightly wrap it up, okay? Like so. And then just set it aside. And what's gonna happen as it rests, it's actually gonna keep hydrating. So when you unwrap it, it's gonna feel softer than it does now. The hydration process happens really slowly with flour. Flour takes a while to absorb the moisture from egg. So during the next half hour, it's continuing to slowly hydrate with that egg. So the texture will be different. So when you are finishing off a pasta dough, you always want it to feel a little stiffer than you want it to be when it's rested and ready to roll out. If you have a really soft dough, it's going to keep hydrating and it might end up too sticky when you roll it out.